You've heard the quote, "If I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses." It's everywhere. Tech talks, business books, startup pitches. But Henry Ford never said it. The real story is more surprising, more practical, and way more relevant to how innovation actually happens. This video breaks down the myth and what Ford really understood about creating the future. You've probably seen it quoted in leadership books, TED Talks, LinkedIn posts, and startup pitch decks. If I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. It's everywhere. It's the go-to line for entrepreneurs trying to explain why they're building something no one's asking for, yet. It resonates because it feels like permission to ignore critics, to trust your gut, and to chase a vision bigger than the market can currently imagine. It's become gospel for anyone trying to invent the future, whether in tech, design, or business. But here's the twist. Henry Ford never said it. The quote suggests that true innovation doesn't come from listening to customers. It comes from knowing what they really need before they do. It paints the innovator as a lone visionary, someone so far ahead of their time that ordinary people can't keep up. It flatters the idea of genius, that breakthrough products are born not from feedback or iteration, but from bold instinct. For founders and creatives, it's comforting. It says, don't worry if no one gets it yet. You're probably just like Ford. But that's a dangerously oversimplified view. Humans love neat little stories. A short, punchy quote that captures a big idea? Even better. The business world thrives on these bite-sized myths because they're easy to remember, easy to share, and easy to build a brand around. This Ford quote checks every box. It makes innovation seem effortless and heroic. No messy product development, no trial and error. Just one brilliant leap, but the real process behind transformative ideas is rarely so cinematic, and ironically, the truth about Henry Ford is far more interesting than the myth. There's no evidence, none, that Henry Ford ever uttered those words. They don't appear in his autobiography, in any interview, speech, or archive. Historians have searched thoroughly. The Ford Motor Company itself has confirmed the quote is apocryphal. It was never part of Ford's documented thinking. In fact, it contradicts much of what he actually believed about customers, production, and progress. So if he didn't say it, where did this quote come from, and why has it become so deeply embedded in our cultural idea of innovation? The earliest mentions of the quote don't show up until the 1980s or 90s, decades after Ford's death in 1947. It seems to have started as a paraphrase, possibly from consultants or authors trying to make a point about innovation. From there, it snowballed. Repetition bred authority. The quote fit too perfectly into the narrative of Silicon Valley and disruptive thinking to be questioned. Over time, it was attributed directly to Ford, even though there was no source. And like many myths, once it was sticky enough, it started to feel like truth. Fake quotes spread because they're simple, emotional, and easy to repeat. They travel like memes, detached from their source, stripped of nuance, and injected with authority by the names they're tied to. Henry Ford isn't alone. Einstein is constantly credited with things he never said. Churchill, Lincoln, even Maya Angelou, same story. Once a quote fits a narrative we want to believe, it doesn't matter if it's real. It just needs to feel right. But when we stop questioning where these ideas come from, we risk building entire beliefs and businesses on fiction. This isn't just a fact check. The problem with the faster horses myth is that it completely distorts how innovation actually works. It suggests Ford succeeded in spite of listening to people, when in reality, his success came because he understood them deeply. The quote glamorizes the lone genius, but the real process of building something groundbreaking involves listening, observing, and translating real needs into new solutions. Ford didn't dismiss users, he studied them. Misquoting him hides what made his approach so effective in the first place. Henry Ford wasn't born into power or wealth. He grew up on a Michigan farm, took apart watches as a kid, and trained as a machinist before becoming an engineer at Edison's company. What set him apart wasn't just technical skill, it was a relentless obsession with systems, efficiency, and scale. He wasn't trying to invent something flashy. He was trying to solve a problem millions of people faced: affordable, reliable transportation. He didn't build a car for the elite. He built one for everyday Americans and changed history in the process. Ford may not have used focus groups, but he absolutely paid attention to people. He watched how they lived, worked, and moved. He saw that rural families and urban workers needed better ways to travel. He studied why early cars were expensive and unreliable, and fixed it. He didn't ask people what they wanted in the abstract. He observed what they needed in reality. That's not ignoring customers. That's design thinking in action, or before it had a name. Ford translated real-world behavior into a product that reshaped the world. So, if Henry Ford never said the quote, and if he wasn't blind to user needs, how did he create something so ahead of its time? How do you build for a future your customers can't quite articulate? That's the real question. And it's not about dismissing people's voices. It's about listening closely enough to hear what they aren't saying yet. Ford's story isn't one of genius in isolation. It's a case study in empathy, systems thinking, and solving the right problem at the right time. Let's unpack how he actually did it. Before the Model T, transportation was slow, messy, and expensive. Most Americans relied on horses or carriages, systems that required constant care, limited travel range, and didn't scale well for the growing middle class. Early automobiles did exist, but they were luxury toys for the wealthy, not practical machines for the average worker or farmer. Roads were rough, infrastructure was sparse, and the idea of owning a car seemed out of reach for most families. The gap between what existed and what was accessible was huge, and that's where Ford saw an opportunity. Ford didn't start with a grand vision of changing the world. He started by noticing what wasn't working. Horses were slow, expensive to maintain, and limiting for people who needed to get around, especially in rural areas. He saw isolation, inefficiency, and wasted time. He didn't ask people what they wanted, he paid attention to what they were frustrated by. His insight wasn't about inventing a new desire. It was about solving an old pain. People didn't need a faster horse. They needed freedom, mobility, and reliability. Ford built the answer to that. Ford's real breakthrough wasn't just the car, it was how he built it. Before the Model T, cars were handcrafted, slow to produce, and wildly expensive. Ford rethought the process. He borrowed from meatpacking and manufacturing techniques to create the moving assembly line, slashing production time and costs. What had been a luxury item became something a working family could afford. By industrializing not just the product but the process, he opened the door to mass adoption. The innovation wasn't just in engineering, it was in systems thinking. Henry Ford didn't invent the automobile, that credit goes to engineers in Germany and France years earlier, but those machines weren't designed for the masses, they were novelties. Ford's genius was seeing a way to take that technology and make it universal. He stripped out the unnecessary, simplified the design, and made the car rugged enough for everyday roads. He didn't just make a car, he made a car that worked for regular people. It wasn't invention that changed the world, it was access. That was Ford's real innovation. The most important thing Ford understood is this. People don't always know how to ask for what they need, but their behavior leaves clues. He didn't rely on surveys or hypothetical questions. He watched how people lived, how far they traveled, how long it took, what they avoided, what they tolerated. Instead of listening only to what people said, he focused on what they did. That's where the real demand lives, and that's the lesson so many innovators miss when they lean too hard on the faster horses myth. Despite the myth, Henry Ford didn't operate in a vacuum. He tested his designs relentlessly, often in real-world conditions, and made changes based on how people actually used the car, not just how they talked about it. Early versions of the Model T went through constant revisions, tweaks in materials, mechanical parts, and design choices driven by user interaction. Ford's process wasn't about ignoring feedback, it was about getting the right kind of feedback. He learned by watching what broke, what worked, and what slowed people down, and then he fixed it. The problem with the faster horses mindset is that it starts with the wrong kind of question. If you ask people what they want, you'll often get surface-level answers tied to what they already know. Ford didn't ask, what would make your travel easier? He looked at the root problem. People needed faster, more reliable, more affordable ways to get from place to place. Innovation comes from identifying unmet needs, not by polling preferences, but by observing struggles. That's how you design something people didn't know they needed until they used it. Henry Ford left behind plenty of documented quotes, but none that sound like the faster horses line. What he did say was more practical and revealing. There is one rule for the industrialist, and that is, make the best quality of goods possible at the lowest cost possible, paying the highest wages possible. That's not the voice of a man ignoring people. It's the voice of someone thinking holistically. He wasn't trying to defy the market, he was trying to serve it better, through smarter systems, better products, and more empowered workers. The fake quote survives because it's tidy. It compresses the complexity of innovation into a single, dramatic moment of genius. It suggests you don't need data or users or testing, just vision and guts. That's flattering to would-be disruptors. It tells a clean story, while the truth that innovation is often slow, collaborative, and uncertain is harder to package. The faster horses myth lives on, not because it's accurate, but because it's satisfying. It confirms a narrative we want to believe about boldness, even if it distorts how real progress happens. The damage isn't just historical, it's happening right now. This kind of thinking encourages leaders to mistake arrogance for vision. It promotes building at users instead of with them. When leaders idolize the lone genius myth, they often stop listening, stop testing, and stop evolving. Real innovation requires curiosity, humility, and constant iteration. Ford understood that. He didn't ignore the public, he understood them better than they understood themselves. The lesson isn't to silence feedback, it's to get smarter about how you hear it. Take Steve Jobs, often lumped in with Ford in the ignore the customer myth, but Jobs didn't build in a vacuum. He studied how people use technology, obsessed over design details, and surrounded himself with teams constantly testing ideas. Innovation isn't about rejecting feedback, it's about translating it. The best innovators blend empathy, imagination, and execution. They don't just dream up products, they decode problems. That's what Ford did, that's what Jobs did. Real innovation comes from listening, just not always in the ways people expect. But let's not turn Ford into a flawless figure. His legacy is complicated. He held deeply anti-Semitic views, publishing harmful propaganda that later inspired extremists. He clashed with labor unions and resisted worker rights even while raising wages. These contradictions matter. They remind us that innovation doesn't make someone a moral authority. We can learn from what Ford got right, but we also have to acknowledge what he got dangerously wrong. Every historical figure is layered, and understanding those layers helps us build a clearer picture of progress. Here's what the real story of Ford and the fake quote actually teaches us. Innovation is not magic. It's not a moment of divine genius. It's a messy, iterative, often frustrating process. It requires vision, yes, but also systems, strategy, and the humility to adapt. The most powerful breakthroughs don't come from ignoring people. They come from understanding them deeply, sometimes more deeply than they understand themselves. That's not myth-making, that's real innovation. And it's harder, more human, and more meaningful than any viral quote. So, if what do you want isn't the right question, what is? The better question is, what are you struggling with? That shift is everything. It moves the conversation from fantasy to friction, from imagined desires to real-world constraints. People didn't need to say, like, we want a car. They were already saying in their lives, like, we need to go farther, faster, cheaper. And innovation begins when you stop taking answers at face value and start noticing the underlying problems. That's how you stop chasing faster horses and start building something better. And that's the final insight. Vision isn't about dreaming in isolation, it's about standing firmly in reality and seeing what others overlook. Ford understood the terrain, the roads, the wallets, the weather, the daily grind of the people he was designing for. He didn't romanticize the future, he solved for the present with just enough foresight to stretch what was possible. Vision without context is fantasy, but vision rooted in reality, that's where transformation begins. Not in the myth, not in the quote, but in the work. We cling to myths because they're easy. They compress complexity into something bite-sized and satisfying. Faster horses sounds like a rebellious stroke of genius. One man against the world. But real progress doesn't usually look like that. It's messy, it's layered. It takes time and effort to understand. When we trade truth for simplicity, we lose the lessons that actually matter. The real story of Henry Ford isn't as clean, but it's more useful, more honest, and ultimately more inspiring. Despite the myth of the lone inventor, Ford didn't build the modern car industry by himself. He was surrounded by engineers, factory workers, designers, mechanics, and marketers. The success of the Model T wasn't one man's spark. It was a coordinated system. The assembly line wasn't just Ford's idea, it was refined by a team. Innovation at scale is always collaborative. The more we celebrate that truth, the better we understand what it really takes to change the world. So, what do we do with all this? Whether you're an entrepreneur, a teacher, a designer, or anyone trying to build something new, here's the takeaway. Innovation requires a different kind of listening. Not to surface-level requests, but to deeper patterns, to frustrations, to behavior. It's not about being a genius, it's about being observant, patient, and curious. The future doesn't arrive because you ignore people, it arrives because you understand them better than they understand themselves. If we're going to replace the quote, let's make it better, try this. Observe deeply, think boldly, build humbly, observe what people actually do, think beyond their current solutions, then build something grounded in reality, but brave enough to push it forward. That's how real change happens. Not through clever sound bites, but through thoughtful, persistent human work. Ford didn't predict the future, he engineered it. One decision, one detail, one day at a time. So, next time you hear someone say, if I had asked people, they'd have said faster horses. Pause, not to fact-check them, but to offer something better. Tell the real story. The one where Henry Ford listened closely, solved real problems, and built a system that changed the world. That story doesn't need a myth. It just needs to be told clearly and passed on. Because truth, even when it's messier, has more power than any polished quote ever could. So, let's stop chasing myths and start honoring the messier, more meaningful truths behind real innovation. If this video gave you a new perspective, consider subscribing for more stories that cut through the noise. Like the video if it made you think. And if you've got a moment, leave a comment below. Here's what I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever seen a myth like this shape how people think about creativity or leadership? And what's a faster horses moment you've encountered in your own work or life? Let's keep the conversation going.